My name is Coleman Hemphill, president of the Texas Hemp Industries Association. I appreciate Celeste asked me to moderate. I am joined today by Tamara Bibb. Is that how you spell your last name? Or pronounce
Bibbs.
it? Huh?
Tamara Bibbs.
Bibbs. Mike Sandoval and Jeremy Sherman. That's what I thought. If you would please introduce yourself, tell people a little bit about your business, and we'll get into some more questions related to Texas regulations. So Jeremy, you want to start us off?
Sure. Jeremy Sherman. I'm co-founder of Bayou City Hemp Company. We're a CO2 processor here in Houston. I see some people out here that we know. And so we basically work with the farmer all the way through to help. We have a sampler on our staff who handles regulatory and bring in Texas biomass, and we use our CO2 supercritical methods, testing 5 times throughout the process, and then we have a formulations team who formulates our end products.
My name is Tamara Bibbs. I am the owner of IV20 Houston. We provide agriculture risk management and business solutions for farmers and landowners. We provide that through our farm service packages. We offer financial assistance. We offer staff sourcing. We provide training as well as business solutions in terms of SOPs, recall plans, and just really helping you understand the technical side of your business.
Mike Sandoval. I manage Sante Laboratories. We're a contract development and manufacturing organization in Austin, Texas, and we help supplement and drug companies take concepts from benchtop to clinic all the way through commercialization, and we also have a third-party testing arm.
Excellent. So real quick from the crowd, can I get a show of hands at how many people are cultivators in the room? So we've got 2 cultivators. How many folks processors? So we got 2 there. How many folks are in retail? Excellent. How many of y'all are sourcing Texas products in your retail stores currently? A couple here. So most people are receiving, how many of y'all are receiving your hemp products, whether flower or oil, from other states currently? Okay. Right on. Okay. So with that, we'll kind of quickly touch on some of the regs as it relates to traceability in the field, the licensing required, and then we can kind of move into more of processing and end product issues you might face. So Jeremy, if you want to kind of and what kind of licensing you should be requesting from farmers, if you want to kind of touch on that.
Yeah, sure. And so, you know, if you guys are growing here in the state, you obviously need to register with the Texas Department of Ag and get a TDA grower license. And then through the chain of custody, you know, as you grow, I would work with a lab like Mike's or another lab here in the state or even out of the state. That's the first thing you need to do. Second thing, you need to get a sampler, and I think you have 15 days, is that correct, on the sampling? Mm-hmm. You have a 15-day window, correct? Is that correct, tomorrow? And so once you do that, then obviously you need to get in touch with somebody like myself as a processor here in the state, and then you have to have a manifest, and you have to have a COA from someone like Mike, and then we'll receive your biomass.
Yep. Tamara, can you kind of talk about the different issues that people face if they're sourcing products from Texas? What kind of paperwork do you need, and what's your best justification to law enforcement?
You definitely want to have your manifest. That's going to be very important. And you want to make sure that it's what is actually in your load. I don't know, kind of know how to. But you definitely want to make sure that all your paperwork is in order. And that's going to be really important because when you're looking at it from a regulatory standpoint, that's what they're going to use to make sure that your paperwork, that you are doing what you're supposed to do in terms of how you're operating and moving your products throughout the state of Texas. Coming from law enforcement, I can tell you that is one of the things that they're going to be a stickler on, is making sure that your paperwork is together and that it is correct.
Yeah. Mike, could you kind of expand, as someone who takes in raw materials, whether domestically sourced here in Texas or outside, the process people need to begin going through in product development and specific tests to Texas and DSHS, what that relationship looks like and how that interacts with the FDA and kind of broader regulations around food ingredients and new products.
That's
Sure.
great.
Thanks, Coleman. And just to quickly follow up with Tamara's comment on the paperwork, under the Texas Department of Ag, that paperwork is very well defined, with these chain of custodies and these manifests. And when the sample arrives to a laboratory with a sampler, there's a very important step of a signature sign-off. So it's transferring the sample from the sampler to our lab, and there should be that traceability. And that's really important from a documentation perspective because it's chain of custody. And when the lab takes custody of that sample, they will preferably do the testing within a couple of days and get the results back to the farmer. So if it is a compliance test with the TDA, where you're going to have the OSX number or US for unofficial sample, that is the official samples get reported to both the farmer, the consumer, which is our customer, as well as the Texas Department of Ag. And we send all these CFAs to Jeffrey Claxton. He oversees that. So 2 documents usually come with that. One, you get a certificate from your laboratory that states, your total THC as well as anything else you ordered for that lab. And then you get a form called RHP 816. And that form is what we submit to the Texas Department of Agriculture, which just states total THC, whether it's a pass or fail, has the measurement of uncertainty right underneath underneath that result, as well as all of the farmer information that you would need. So it has the facility ID number, has the producer's number, it's going to have the sampler number, who is the sampler, how much they sampled from, as well as the signatures from the laboratory. So those are the key pieces of documents that, to tomorrow's point, is incredibly important to have. And if you are moving anything, I would always have as a backup the lab CFA as well as that TDA CFA that they receive, because that's what's on record with the state. It's not we don't send our branded CFAs to the state. We only send what the state requires us to send, which is that RHP 816. And it's a 1-page CFA that just states total THC.
Excellent. So this question really comes from the prompt and in relation to banking. So could y'all kind of talk just on a personal standpoint, what processes you've gone through in banking and what you see in the future as being prerequisites for borrowing in regard to providing this licensing to the different banks to show that you're in compliance?
Sure.
Well, I was just going to speak briefly. One of the things that we definitely have to look at when it comes to banking is that the banking industry right now is just kind of on a standstill when it comes to how they will loan out money to cannabis businesses. And here's what I mean. We worked with a bank near Dallas who was interested in working with cannabis businesses. But once they sat down and looked at the risk that they could potentially take on from that type of business, they opted to look at not going with cannabis businesses, which hurts us in now during a time like COVID when you need operating cash. So one of the things that I personally have witnessed with my clients is that particular issue, being able to get funding and get loans from traditional banking sources to where you can be sustainable, especially during COVID right now.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue. I mean, if I could reiterate one point on the banking, it's know your bankers. It's a relationship game. And so don't just, make phone calls. Don't just send emails. You need to get to know these people because more than anything, it's really, the risk is on them. So they need to feel comfortable with what you're doing. I mean, literally, we had some bankers from here in Houston at our facility 2 days ago. And we don't use them, but you always should be looking for secondary banks, third banks. And so that's the biggest thing I can reiterate.
And make sure your financials are in order, because that's one of the things, you definitely don't want that to be a hindrance in you being able to get funding, because there's also other sources. There's investors, there's pitch competitions, there's other ways to be able to get funding, even outside of a traditional banking source.
But I will say, a lot of these banks will work with you if they see that you're profitable and you're doing everything the right way, they will lend. But it's it's a relationship game, and it's something you're going to have to work on.
Yeah, transparency is incredibly important. That relationship with the bank will determine whether you're a long-term client or you're a very short-term client, and never try to hide anything from bankers, because they'll eventually find out. They'll look at transaction history, to frequency, to amounts, et cetera. We're very fortunate to have bankers in our team, so we have a good understanding what that looks like. There are larger banks setting up pilot programs, and in Texas, there are some great banks that are openly willing to work with farmers as well as, hemp processors and brands. And, I don't think they have a choice because it's such a thriving, maturing market that money is involved in that supply chain somewhere. So I think the understanding, educating your banker on what kind of business you are. If you're a finished product supplier, or you're producing products for commercial use, do you have the right insurances in place? And a lot of consumer brands don't have it. And, what kind of products are you making? So there's a lot of factors that go into it. We're firm believers that, technical due diligence is going to be required. We've already had discussions with big banks that, what's a good C of A and what's not a good C of A, what lab to trust and what lab not to trust. And I think it's going to take some time to understand, all those dynamics. And this is where the data is really important, that the frequency of testing is really important to this, two-way dialogue that Tamara has discussed.
Yep. No, and definitely want to echo that. So, understand that you're in a room in the state of Texas that just had its first crop this year. Every bit of data this year is leading us towards insurance, which is generally a 3-year process, and that insurance is established on a county-by-county basis. So what is your average yield and what was the profitability of your crop? Even if you're doing an acre, a small amount. And in fact, I'd almost encourage people looking long-term to mitigate a lot of that risk on the front end, get a good sustainable model in place. This based on data, and you're not, if you grow it, they will come type person. In regard to banking, and totally agree with all these things. The transparency element of this is so important, and really one of the best resources I've found in the state that's taken a very different approach and pretty unique to the hemp industry is a group called Risk Scout, formerly Verileaf. And really from a regulatory standpoint, they're essentially creating scored profiles for different businesses based upon the licenses, the transparency, the traceability, the security of the in transaction for these people. And so again, acquiring all of that data, being in compliance is very, very important. This is a question I've been really excited to ask all of y'all today. Where do y'all see 2021 going, and what would be the implications for the hemp industry if the MORE Act continues to move forward? Where do you see that impacting Texas specifically?
Could you describe the MORE Act in a little more context? I think the audience will.
So it's essentially a bill that was passed in the U.S. House of Representatives last week that would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substance Act. Absolutely groundbreaking. The first time we've had anything like that introduced and passed through the House. There are a number of provisions related to social equity, people of color, a number of items that are still up for discussion in the Senate. There has been some rumblings that this is something that McConnell will take up, but there are, there are still some ongoing Senate races out of Georgia that will be big factors there. I guess the question, if marijuana is removed from the Controlled Substance Act, how much of what we're doing in the hemp industry do we see carrying over into that industry, and what would that loosen up for the hemp industry in Texas if that were to happen?
I think that for me, because I love the industrial side of the hemp industry, and I think that when it comes to the MORE Act, one of the things that we have to look at in the state of Texas when it comes to especially social equity and social justice is what is currently in place, and then how can those changes be made so that it's equal for everyone who's looking to get into the industry and being able to maintain and sustain their businesses at whatever phase they are within the integration process. And when we talk about the MORE Act and we talk about expungement, being able to come in with a criminal record or some type of criminal background in light of the restrictions being loosened, I think that we have to take a step back before we start carrying briefcases. We have to look at those who've been affected by the bracelets. And I think that until we can take an honest look at it and come up with a solution that is, it makes the entry process obtainable. And right now, with the licenses being at the price that they are, that's an obtainable entry compared to some states. And how can we encourage those persons to, one, apply for those licenses and help them in their business ventures going forward within the state of Texas?
I agree wholeheartedly. In the right direction, and it's going to do nothing but bring more legitimacy to the hemp industry. Mm-hmm. And so, again, when we're just talking about banking and you're tiptoeing around what you're doing, or, again, hopefully find a partner that you can work with, you're not going to have to do all those things in quite the same manner, I do believe.
Yeah. So, and the MORE Act stands for the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. Definitely something to follow. In Texas, there's been a number of different bills already introduced. A great resource for the marijuana-related bills that have been filed, and just the small summaries on that can be found at Texas Normal. I'll also be posting them at txhia.org soon. There's a number of bills related to decriminalization, and really, some of the bills that are interesting based on the authorship are really proposing resolutions, a joint resolution that would bring medical and recreational, potentially if they're to pass, to a vote. So it would be held next November 2nd. These are items that are being introduced right now. I think the timing within the state, just to kind of give you perspective on that, immediately following the presidential election, or just a couple days after that, is when members can begin introducing new legislation. A lot of those early file bills generally do become the more priority bills. They get an earlier number. The higher the number, the more you get kind of pushed out. So your representatives, we know who our elected officials are in Texas right now. Definitely engaging them, asking where they are with hemp items, but also asking about these other bills. And my biggest encouragement to you in really advocating with your local elected officials is ask a lot of questions and really respectfully request and demand those answers. As I think one of the greatest ways to win an argument is 100% questions-based. Because many of us do know the answers to these things, and still many people have not asked the question. Different regulations related to processing and manufacturing for smokable products, and where you see that issue moving in 2021.
Sure. And this is, so as we know, it was by DSHS rules, it was the smokable product in the state of Texas is banned. So that would include both, a pre-roll or something like that, or a vape cartridge, to my understanding. And so from there was a lawsuit, and so there's now an injunction through February 21st or 22nd?
Second.
22nd?
Second.
February 2nd.
The beginning of February.
February 2. Okay, so again, my personal opinion is I think that injunction. Now, this is just my opinion. I don't know. I think that it'll be pushed out further, and I think that it will continue for a while next year. Again, I talked to quite a few attorneys, and they have different perspectives on that, so that's just my own opinion.
Yeah, I think the existing DSHS final rules, they need to be revisited. Mm-hmm. If you look at the original statute, which was just purely aspirational, what the industry can do versus what the actual final rules said what we can do, there is a rightful place for smokable flower in Texas as long as there's a responsible oversight of it. And, one of the main reasons I think that, DSHS did not, initially or allow smokable flower is that they didn't have a suitable safety program in place. I mean, if you scout any other state that allows smokable flower, very different testing requirements compared to what is existing in the existing DSHS rules. And there's a lot of intention behind that. And just an example is like water activity or moisture content. The route of inhalation is one of the most risky route of administrations that a consumer can do, which is why, those route of administrations in a pharmaceutical drug product are sterile, they're clean, and they're very expensive. So when we look at smokable flower, there will be a rightful place here in Texas, but unless there's more robust testing requirements on flower that's meant for that route of administration, I don't see it going very far here in Texas.
Could you expand, beyond the mycotoxin, moisture content, what further testing do you think is prudent to provide for better safety of those products in the state?
It's a good question. Like moisture content and water activity, ASTM has a really good publication that looked at moisture content and water activity is what may be more indicative of microbial proliferation or safety, which is ultimately what we're all after. Mm-hmm. To Coleman's point is, aspergillus is an important endpoint to look at. UC Davis did a great paper where they looked at 20 different common medical marijuana strains in California. Levels of aspergillus. And in the California, which is the initial medical program, it was meant for vulnerable patients that had some sort of disease where cannabis was an effective treatment for themselves. And these patients are commonly immunocompromised. So the conclusions of the paper is that if these consumers or patients are inhaling cannabis, and they are immunocompromised, then there's a high risk of them having aspergillosis, which is a very serious infection that could only come through cannabis. And, it's a great paper. Cannabis has never killed anyone. I'm confident to say that, but things on cannabis have. And there's papers in the 70s that discuss this very thing. And this is why, aspergillus, moisture, water activity, and even a few others, those should be monitored for a safe smokable program.
Mike, do you think there's been enough research done on this? I mean, I'm not as familiar with some of these studies.
Chapter, and even though they're not necessarily like regulating, coming up with tests to regulate consumable products, I'm really excited about what they want to do with, the industrial applications of hemp. Specifically, there is a lot of compelling information, and I think for a normal adult that's consuming cannabis through inhalation, we're probably okay with some levels of mycotoxins or aspergillus. But whether that's the same true for children or immunocompromised or your mom and pa and grandma, that's a
Definitely a concern.
Tamara, did you want to add to that?
Well, no, I was just saying it's definitely a concern. It's
Yeah.
definitely a concern.
Well, and if I could get you to expand even further, would you suggest a protocol at different points in production? I mean, both testing of the live plant immediately from the field, material that's tested post-drying, because, for those that have grown the plant, the opportunity for mold to proliferate, and mold is very common within all cannabis plants, is at full maturity. At full maturity, the more dense that flower becomes, the bigger it becomes, the more moisture it can hold. And so it just becomes this big sponge. And many times during full maturity is when you get a lot of your spring rains. So from Oregon to Texas, generally in September, you're looking at multiple days of rain, where you get 2, 3 or more days, you are going to have mold begin to proliferate in that flower. The next point where that plant's most vulnerable, if it's smushed together, and again, that moisture is being pushed in, you can get more mold proliferation through that. What would be your suggestion in regard to when you should test, how you should test, and what the requirements should be to help mitigate some of the mold issues that exist?
Sure. The curing step is very important. And, when we work with, cultivators of all shapes and sizes, it's very common, we like to emphasize that, whether they're outsourcing the curating part, because this moisture that Coleman's describing is real. And if it just there is a very high risk towards microbial proliferation. So from a testing perspective, from a cultivation perspective, you can't control the weather. Unless you're indoor grow, you have very defined set parameters that allow you to control things. But most of the farmers in Texas are doing outdoor grow. So I think over 2021 specifically, we're going to see a lot of innovation around remediation from a microbiological standpoint. Remediation for THC is one, and it's very important. But for how do you remediate your microbials? Because if you're outdoor grow and you test for total yeast and mold or total aerobic count, E. coli, you're going to find things. So what is that limit? And I think we got to work with legislation to define what is a safe parameter to test for. Because the last thing a lab wants to do is to provide bad results to a cultivator, to a brand, to an extractor. It's the worst thing that we could do as a lab. And traditionally, when we see bad results, we retest it because we don't want to provide bad results to or ruin someone's day. So testing is, never over test. That's not something that any lab should promote. So it's just determining at what stage of that life cycle, from when you plant to you harvest to your curing step to your extraction step. And that's where that relationship becomes really important, and not only with your bank, but also with your laboratory.
Yeah.
And having a recall plan in place
Yes.
for that, because, what are going to be your steps if that testing does come back, bad? What are your processes going to be, and how do you move forward from that? What's your continuation plan, especially if that's your whole crop? So
Absolutely.
I think it's definitely important to have all those steps in place when you're talking about your SOPs also.
Yeah, that's something great to think about for 2021, because I can tell you that, most of the farmers that we've dealt with this year, they did not have that in place. So if you do have those mold issues, if you do have those issues, there was no plan B.
Yeah. So, kind of still on the same smokable discussion. So the statute prohibits the processing and manufacturing of hemp products for smoking, and smoking is defined as both vaping or burning a particular product. That relates to products that have an intended end use. So a pre-roll has an intended implied end use. Vape carts, same deal. All of the testing that Mike's talking about for flower are things that people should be looking at, but there has, and I think broadly been agreed to from everything I've heard from DSHS, that hemp flower, not packaged in a particular way, without an intended end use, and labeled not intended for smoking, has been probably one of the more popular products that's going out in the state and is compliant. That being said, safety's always got to be the key moving forward. Of items that y'all are watching this next session, and what y'all suggestions are to fix or to make better our Texas hemp program.
Sure. And just to touch back on the smokable, and I think we've heard that you can label that as tea additive, or there are some issues with doing that. I mean, to the end consumer. So I would talk to an attorney before you start to go down that path, just to let you guys know that. So some of the issues that we have for this year, again, I think the big one is this smokable, and I love everything that Mike said on getting those regulations down. So we're testing and we're doing the right things to put a quality and safe product out there. I think that's first and foremost paramount in our industry. From a processing standpoint and what we do, I would obviously love the gray area on our processing and the work in process that we do. I would like that to be addressed and have some sort of 1% threshold, because obviously what we do, if we as a processor don't turn the product into oil and then into the consumer products, then this industry doesn't work.
I think for me, I'm focusing more on the compliance and really making sure that those who do not comply, they have to go through the process. I think that's one of the areas that I would really like to see, and that's in enforcement, because I think that at the end of it, we want to make sure that we have good, safe, quality products. And I think that making sure that the enforcement of these licenses and enforcements of what it takes to maintain these licenses are done, and it's done in a way that helps the business owner to maintain the compliance as well as the safety for our customers, because at the end of the day, that's who we want to make sure is getting these clean, safe, good products is our consumers.
Yeah. Tamar, can I get you to expand upon the education that really needs to be happening with law enforcement to understand this? All of this happens really quickly. What steps in education to the regulators and to law enforcement do you think still needs to be done?
Well, there's a lot of education when it comes to law enforcement, partly because law enforcement is not educated about cannabis the way they are other drugs or mental illness or traffic stops. There's a lot of educating that law enforcement receives, but cannabis is not one of them. And I think that in order for law enforcement's mindset to change about it, we have to look at educating law enforcement about it also. Otherwise, every time you get pulled over for a traffic stop, you're going to have a problem. And it doesn't matter what county you're in, what city, there's still going to be one person that's still going to look at this as a drug versus a plant. And I think that when we start the educating from that standpoint as a plant, then we can start the conversation for the understanding that this is a plant that helps people, it's healing people, explaining to them the different trends in the industry, because right now it's just a one-track mind. Everybody is smoking to get high. So just really explaining to them the cannabis industry as a whole, from the legal standpoints to the trends that go on, and even as a consumer, your rights to be able to consume the product.
Yeah. How do you think individuals can engage in that education process, both with law enforcement as well as your school districts? I know you have a background with Houston ISD, Child Protective Services related items that have been issues that we've dealt with in the past around this. How can people engage in pushing that education and support the work that you're doing?
I can tell you this, advocacy is very important. I can look across the room and I can see that there's several moms, and at some point you've had to take a break, right? And so I think that when it comes to CPS and when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to the school districts, even when it comes to our doctors and understanding why we're using the products and how they benefit us, we have to be able to have open conversations. And I think that's where a lot of the apprehension is having those open conversations. I don't. I wear it proudly everywhere I go. I want people to ask me about it. As soon as I say something, I've had judges all the way up and down, they want to know. And so I think that when we can look at our own communities, our own circles, and use that as an opportunity to talk about this space, because as business owners, that's what we should be doing anyway, is educating our public, educating our neighbors that's in our strip centers. We have to start with the basis, and that's the education. We provide the education, so if you know anyone that could utilize it, definitely, you have a panel here of excellent source to utilize. Reach out to us and, see what we can do to help stimulate the conversations, especially those ones that are hard to have.
Yeah, I do think law enforcement, I think the mentality is changing on a case-by-case basis, but like you said, it kind of starts from the top down, and you've
right.
got to get there and educate them so it can trickle down.
Right.
But,
And it starts with the licensing agency that's over law enforcement, and I think that it has to be part of the training program, just like we have trainings for everything else. This needs to be incorporated into it, and today, when the legislative session goes in, it needs to be part of it.
And Mike, I'll give you kind of last word, and we can open up for a few questions.
Sure. In 2021, what I would like to see change, or like the existing regulations as being optimized, to, Coleman's initial, second to last question was, what do we expect the MORE Act and, potentially federal legalization of cannabis and hemp? What does that mean? Right now, the way we look at the hemp and cannabis market is it's in a very linear growth phase. When there is additional flexibility, whether it's from the feds or more flexibility from the state, you're going to have this exponential or hockey puck moment. And without regulations that touch on all the important points of testing to remediation to extraction to safety to how do we move product from one position to the other, that's going to be incredibly important, and it's going to require all of us and everyone in this room to work with your representatives to go speak to your senators and really describe what that is. And for smokable hemp, as long as there's safety regulations and there's protocols to ensure safety, I think it should live in Texas. And that's just to remove all the political jargon. I mean, if safety's not there, then it should be banned. And that's how it should be.
Excellent. So we got a little bit of time for a few questions. If y'all have a question, please raise your hand. I'll get you a microphone. Initial questions? Anybody? Excellent. Well, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you, guys. We'll be around. Appreciate y'all's time.